The rain did not fall that night. It attacked. It came in violent wind-driven sheets across the cobblestones of Ashford Lane, swallowing lantern light whole and turning every shadow into something threatening. Eleanor Whitmore ran through it all, her ivory gown soaked through, her hair torn loose from its pins, her breath arriving in jagged bursts that burned her throat. She did not look back. She could not afford to. The sound of boots, heavy, organized, deliberate, told her everything she needed to understand about how little time remained. Lord Ashcombe's men were close. Too close. And if they dragged her back before the church bells announced sunrise, she would lose everything her father had built across 30 years of quiet, honorable struggle. The will had been clear, and cruelly so. Eleanor must be wed before dawn, or the entirety of the Whitmore estate passes to the nearest male claimant, a clause buried so deeply inside the document that even her father's own solicitor had turned pale when he read it aloud. Ashcombe had planted it there. She was certain of it now. Certain the way one is certain of a blade already pressed against the skin. She rounded a corner and collided with something immovable. Not a wall. A man. He caught her before she struck the ground, one arm steady as iron, the other braced against the alley's stone arch. She felt the solidity of him, the absolute stillness, and it struck her as impossibly strange. Most men startled. This one simply absorbed the impact and held her upright as though she weighed nothing at all. "They're going to take everything," she gasped, gripping his sleeve. "I need a husband. Right now. This moment. I know how that sounds. I know." "How many?" he asked. She blinked. "I beg your pardon? The men following you." He was already looking past her shoulder, calm as a man reading at a fireside. "How many?" "4. Perhaps 5. He nodded once. Then he stepped around her. What followed lasted perhaps 90 seconds. Eleanor heard a single grunt of surprise, 2 sharp impacts, and then silence, broken only by rain and the distant toll of a church bell beginning its long, slow count toward dawn. When the stranger returned, not a single hair on his head was displaced. He looked at her with dark, unreadable eyes and said, "You mentioned you needed a husband." Who was this man, and why did he already seem to know exactly who she was? Eleanor's full name was Eleanor Catherine Whitmore, and until 4 days ago, she had believed her life to be a reasonably settled thing. Her father, Sir Edmund Whitmore, had been a gentleman of modest fortune and boundless integrity, a man who kept meticulous records, corresponded faithfully with his solicitors, and never once gave Eleanor reason to suspect that disaster was quietly assembling itself around them. Then Edmund died, and the disaster arrived by sealed envelope. The clause, written in precise legal language that managed to feel almost gentle despite being monstrous, required any unmarried female heir to secure a lawful husband before the sunrise following the reading of the will. If no such union occurred, the estate, the house in Somerset, the London townhouse, the farmlands, the investments, the name itself, transferred immediately to the nearest eligible male claimant. Lord Gerald Ashcombe was that claimant. Eleanor had met Ashcombe twice. Both encounters had left her with a particular sensation of having been examined and found useful, the way a banker might appraise a building he intended to acquire. He was not cruel in any obvious sense. He was simply a man who arranged things to his advantage with the patience and thoroughness of someone who had been doing exactly that for a very long time. She also possessed, tucked inside the lining of her traveling cloak, a packet of letters her father had pressed into her hands on his final evening of consciousness. "Keep these," he had whispered. "They are proof of what was done to me. Do not let Ashcombe know you have them." She had not slept since. She had also not managed to locate a willing groom within the shrinking hours before dawn, until she collided with a stranger in an alley who deflected 5 armed men without apparent effort and then waited for her answer with the patience of someone who had nowhere more pressing to be. "I should tell you," Eleanor said carefully, as he guided her through a narrow passage toward what appeared to be a much better lit street, "that I am not wealthy at the moment. That is, I will be, if I marry before sunrise, but right now I cannot offer. I did not ask for payment." "Then why would you agree? You do not know me." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know enough." She wanted to press him on that. She wanted to demand what, precisely, he believed he knew about her. But something in the quality of his silence made her hold her tongue. A footman appeared at the end of the passage, appearing from nowhere, it seemed, and bowed so deeply his forehead nearly met his knee. She had told herself she was fleeing a trap. It had not yet occurred to her that she might be walking into one. The house they entered was not a house. Eleanor understood this within 3 steps of crossing the threshold. Houses had modest entryways and cozy sitting rooms and the faint smell of coal and cooking. This place had marble floors laid in a herringbone pattern that stretched farther than her eye could comfortably follow, staircases that curved like the inside of a seashell, and enough candlelight burning at midnight to illuminate a cathedral. The staff materialized silently. A housekeeper with an iron posture. 2 footmen. A woman who appeared to be some manner of secretary, clutching a leather folio and watching the stranger, the man who was not yet Eleanor's husband, with the attentiveness of someone awaiting orders. They all bowed. Not the polite dip of servants to an employer. A deep, deliberate acknowledgement of something considerably above that. Eleanor noticed. She filed it away. "Miss Whitmore requires dry clothing," the stranger said, addressing the housekeeper without looking at her. "Something suitable for a brief ceremony." "We have," he glanced at a clock on the mantelpiece, "less than 2 hours." "Of course, Your Grace." The housekeeper had said it so naturally, so reflexively, that the words were half out of Eleanor's mouth before she could stop them. "Your Grace." Everyone in the entryway went very still. The stranger, Your Grace, turned and looked at her with an expression that was not quite a warning and not quite an apology. It occupied some careful space between the two. "A title," he said. "Nothing more." "A duke's title," Eleanor said. He said nothing. He did not need to. She was being led away by the housekeeper before she could decide whether she ought to run or laugh or simply sit down on the marble floor and accept that the evening had exceeded every category of strangeness she had previously considered possible. The gown they brought her was dove-gray silk, clearly expensive, clearly fitted for a woman of her approximate build. When she remarked on this, the housekeeper's expression shifted by a fraction, something flickering behind those composed eyes before professionalism reasserted itself. "The Duke is thorough in his preparations, miss," the woman said carefully. Preparations. As though he had known she was coming. A duke who planned for her arrival. A gown that fit perfectly. And a name she still had not been given, not once. His name was Sebastian Alaric Blackthorne, and Eleanor learned it the way one learns most important things in England, not directly, but through the careful observation of how other people behaved in someone's proximity. A footman who forgot to breathe properly when addressing him. A solicitor summoned at 1 in the morning who arrived within 20 minutes, pale and disheveled but entirely cooperative. A letter sent by courier to Lord Ashcombe's London address, brief and signed, but clearly effective, because when Eleanor's maid slipped outside at 1:30, Ashcombe's men had retreated from the street entirely. Sebastian Blackthorne, Duke of Thornfield, owner of estates in 3 counties. Member of Parliament for reasons that had less to do with democratic aspiration and more to do with the fact that a great many influential people found it easier to cooperate with him than to oppose him. There were also the rumors. His former fiancée, Lady Cecilia Vane, had died 2 years prior under circumstances that the newspapers described as tragic and the whisper networks described as suspicious. The engagement had been arranged by their respective families, and the Duke was said to have approached it with the same cool efficiency he brought to everything else in his life. Whether there had been any warmth between them was a matter of considerable and ongoing debate in London drawing rooms. What was not debated was the aftermath. Sebastian Blackthorne had grown quieter, harder, and more powerful in the 2 years since. Men who had previously maintained a respectful distance now maintained a considerably larger one. Eleanor knew none of this when she sat across from him in a high-backed chair, still slightly damp, wearing a dead woman's dress size, waiting for a solicitor to finish preparing the marriage papers. She knew only what she could observe, that he watched her with the focused patience of someone accustomed to waiting for things to become clear, and that for the first time in 4 days, she felt, inexplicably and rather inconveniently, safe. "You should know," she said, because the silence had become large enough to inhabit, "that I intend to dissolve this arrangement as soon as the inheritance is secured. I will not hold you to it. You have my word." "I know," he said. "You seem very calm about marrying a stranger." I have done stranger things for less reason. She studied him. That is either deeply reassuring or profoundly alarming. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. Perhaps both, he said. But somewhere across London, Lord Ashcombe had just received the Duke's letter, and he was not angry. He was smiling. The ceremony occurred at 4:37 in the morning, in a small private chapel attached to Thornfield House that smelled of beeswax candles and old stone. The solicitor served as witness. A second man, the Duke's personal secretary, a quiet figure named Aldous who seemed to communicate primarily through meaningful eyebrow movements, stood in the doorway as though prepared to block any interference. Eleanor had attended weddings of great pageantry and elaborate sentiment. She had imagined, in the distant, abstract way of young women who have not yet been forced to think practically about such things, that her own would involve flowers and music and a man whose face she already knew. Instead she stood on cold flagstone at nearly 5 o'clock in the morning, wearing borrowed silk, holding a candle, and repeating words after a solicitor who was clearly doing his utmost not to appear as frightened as he felt. The Duke stood beside her. He was impeccably dressed, as though the hour were noon and the occasion expected. His voice, when he repeated his vows, was low and even and entirely composed. He did not look at her when he said the words. He looked at the candle flame. She found herself looking at his profile. There was something there that did not match the rumors. Something careful rather than cold. Something that existed a step behind whatever expression he chose to present to the world. When the solicitor pronounced them wed, he finally turned and met her gaze. The look lasted only a moment. But in it Eleanor saw something she could not immediately name, a recognition that unsettled her more than anything else that had occurred in the preceding 4 hours. "It is done," the solicitor announced, with the relief of a man departing a thunderstorm. Eleanor exhaled. The estate was hers. Her father's work was protected. Ashcombe had been denied. Then the doors opened, and Aldous stepped forward with a sealed envelope. He presented it to the Duke with an expression of careful neutrality. Sebastian read it. His face did not change, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. He folded the paper and tucked it inside his coat. "A message from Ashcombe." "What does it say?" He looked at her for a moment. Then, "That he congratulates us." The word congratulations had never sounded so much like a threat. Ashcombe had wanted her to marry. The question was, why? She woke to pale English light and the sound of larks. For 3 disoriented seconds, Eleanor believed herself to be at home in Somerset, in the familiar narrow bed of her girlhood, with its slightly uneven mattress and the view of the oak tree outside the window. Then the unfamiliar height of the ceiling asserted itself, and the particular quality of the silence, large, well-maintained, inhabited by a great deal of carefully organized staff, reminded her of precisely where she was and, more importantly, who she had married at 4:30 in the morning. Thornfield House was extraordinary in daylight. She explored it the way she explored everything she did not understand, methodically, thoroughly, and with a slightly guilty consciousness that she was probably not supposed to be wandering unaccompanied through corridors that clearly belonged to someone else's life. The library held more volumes than the lending library she had frequented in Bath. The music room contained an Italian harpsichord that a footman told her, unprompted, the Duke never played but had purchased because a composer he admired had once expressed an interest in owning one. There were riding stables that smelled of good hay and horses, a walled garden that someone tended with obvious devotion, and a series of locked rooms at the end of the east corridor that the housekeeper steered her away from with the gentle firmness of someone who had steered people away from things many times before. At breakfast, which she ate alone, the Duke apparently having departed before dawn on business she was not informed of, she began to feel the specific loneliness of someone who has stumbled into another person's entirely complete life. She was not needed here. She was not expected here. She was, at best, a complication that had been graciously accommodated. She was telling herself this, quite firmly, when she rounded a corner in the east corridor and found a door slightly ajar that had not been ajar the previous evening. Inside, a portrait gallery. Long, quiet, light filtering through high windows. And at the far end, facing the wall and covered with a cloth that had slipped to reveal one corner, a canvas larger than all the others. The uncovered corner showed a woman's hand, resting on the arm of a chair. The ring on that hand was gold. The ring on Eleanor's finger, placed there just hours ago, practical and plain, was silver. The portrait was covered. But the woman it depicted had been wearing the same ring Eleanor now possessed. She waited until evening, when the Duke returned. He came in from the rain again. He seemed to have a particular relationship with bad weather, as though it sought him out, and found Eleanor in the drawing room with her hands folded in her lap and an expression he apparently recognized as someone who had spent the day deciding what to ask and how to ask it. He sat. He poured himself a measure of brandy. He waited. "The portrait," she said. A pause of perhaps 3 seconds. "Cecilia." "Your former fiancée." "Yes." "They said she died mysteriously." "People say a great many things." His voice was unreadable. Not defensive. Not dismissive. Simply factual in the way that facts sometimes are when they are being used to fill space where answers should be. "She is wearing my ring." Something moved across his face. Not guilt, precisely, but a cousin of it. An acknowledgment of a complexity he had apparently hoped to postpone. "It was her ring first," he said. "I gave it to you last night because it was close at hand and the hour did not allow for better options. I intended to replace it." "You could have warned me." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" He turned his brandy glass slowly in his fingers, studying the amber movement of the liquid. "Because I did not want you to refuse to wear it." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Did you love her?" He did not answer immediately. When he did, the words were carefully selected. "I respected her greatly. I would have been faithful to her. I would have protected her." A beat. "I failed at the last." "How did she die?" He stood. The conversation, his posture announced, had concluded. But as he reached the doorway, Eleanor heard herself say, "I found a letter tucked behind the portrait frame. It was addressed to you. It has never been opened." He stopped. He did not turn around. His hand on the doorframe was perfectly still. The letter was sealed. And whoever had hidden it there had done so after Cecilia's death. 3 days passed in a careful, circling détente. Eleanor and Sebastian developed the rhythms of people who are learning each other without admitting they are doing so. Two people moving through the same space with a heightened awareness of those who have agreed not to touch a thing and cannot stop noticing it. He brought her books from the library without commenting on it, simply leaving them on the table beside her usual chair. She organized the chaotic correspondence that had apparently been haunting his secretary for months, leaving the sorted files beside his study door without knocking. They ate dinner together and spoke of architecture, of Parliament's recent legislative failures, of a novel they had both, improbably, read. They did not speak of Cecilia, or of the letter, or of the agreement that was supposed to end when the inheritance was legally secured. Eleanor's father's documents, the evidence against Ashcombe, she kept close. They were the only leverage she possessed, and she was not yet certain how to use them without triggering something worse than the problem they were meant to solve. On the 4th morning, she went to retrieve them and found the hidden compartment in her traveling trunk empty. She stood very still in the center of her chamber and counted backward through everyone who had been inside the room since her arrival. Then she dressed, walked to the Duke's study, knocked once, and opened the door before he could respond. "My father's letters are gone." Sebastian set down his pen. "When?" "Overnight." "You are certain they were there yesterday?" "I checked them every evening before I slept." She held his gaze. 3 people had access to my room. Your housekeeper, your footman, and my cousin Haverstock, who arrived yesterday afternoon and whom I was foolish enough to trust with a moment of privacy." Something changed in the Duke's expression. A sharpening. A recognizing. "Haverstock," he said. "Not a question." "He has been in contact with Ashcombe," Eleanor said. "I suspected it. I did not want it to be true." "It is true," Sebastian said. He opened a drawer and slid a letter across the desk. "This arrived this morning. From my own informant inside Ashcombe's circle. Your cousin has been corresponding with him for 6 months." Eleanor picked up the letter. She read it once, set it down, and was quiet for a very long moment. 6 months," she said softly. My father was already ill. Haverstock was in the house. Yes, the Duke said. He was there when my father amended the will. Yes. She looked up. Then the clause wasn't Ashcombe's idea alone. Her cousin had not merely betrayed her. He had betrayed her father, perhaps fatally and deliberately. They confronted Haverstock together. Eleanor had expected protests, deflections, perhaps tears, the full theater of a man caught and choosing performance over truth. What she had not expected was the particular way he looked at her when it became clear there was no exit available. Not shame. Not grief. Something colder and more considered. You think you know what your father was, Haverstock said. His voice had none of its usual ease. You think Edmund Whitmore was a simple gentleman with a simple fortune. I know what he was, Eleanor said. You know what he allowed you to see. Haverstock glanced at the Duke. At Sebastian. A glance freighted with something specific, a recognition, almost. He never told you the will's full truth, did he? The part about who you actually are. Silence. Haverstock. Sebastian's voice was quiet and carried the particular authority of a man who does not raise it because he has never needed to. Choose your next words carefully. Haverstock sat back. And then, with the air of a man releasing something he had carried too long, he told her. Edmund Whitmore had not fathered Eleanor in the conventional sense. He had taken her in, legally, completely, lovingly, from a family of considerably higher standing who had required their infant daughter to disappear from the official record for reasons that had everything to do with the political climate of 1799 and nothing to do with affection. Eleanor was the legitimate heir to a fortune 3 times the size of the Whitmore estate. A fortune currently held in trust by Lord Ashcombe, who had known her true identity for years, who had engineered Edmund's financial ruin to force Eleanor into a vulnerable marriage, who had inserted the Dawn Clause into the will specifically to ensure she would either marry a man of his choosing under pressure, or lose everything. What he had not anticipated was the Duke. Ashcombe had planned for every possibility. Every one, except this. Eleanor asked him that evening. They were in the library, which had become, over the preceding days, something like neutral ground, a space where the formality between them softened without either of them having officially agreed to let it. She sat in the chair that had become, without discussion, hers. He stood at the window. You knew my father, she said. Not an accusation. A fact being placed carefully between them. Yes. How long? 23 years. He did not turn from the window. We met when I was 17. He was already a man of considerable quiet honor, and I was considerably less settled than I am now. He advised me on a matter of some importance. We stayed in contact. He trusted you. He trusted very few people. I was fortunate enough to be among them. Eleanor looked at the ring on her finger. The gold one, she had not let him replace it, in the end. She had said it fit well. That had been almost true. He asked you to watch over me. He wrote to me 8 months ago, when he understood the illness was not going to release him. Sebastian turned, finally, and she could see something in his face that was not the composed surface he generally presented to the world, something that had been there underneath all along and was now simply too tired to stay entirely hidden. He told me what Ashcombe was planning. He told me about the clause. He asked me to position myself so that if you needed help, I could provide it. You were in that alley deliberately. I had been watching Ashcombe's men for 2 days. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. And Cecilia? He inhaled slowly. She discovered the same conspiracy, from a different angle. She was investigating Ashcombe on my behalf when she died. It was not an accident. It was not mysterious. His voice remained steady with effort. Ashcombe had her killed and made it appear otherwise. And I have spent 2 years assembling proof that cannot be dismissed, challenged, or conveniently mislaid. Is the proof complete? It is now. He looked at her steadily. Your father's letters, the ones your cousin stole, were the final component. Aldous intercepted Haverstock before he left the estate. Eleanor stood. She crossed the room. She stood close enough to see the exhaustion behind his eyes, the weight of 2 years of careful, solitary justice. "You should have told me," she said. "From the beginning." "Yes," he agreed. "I should have. Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because your father asked me to protect you. And I was afraid that knowing the full truth too soon would put you in greater danger." A pause. "And because I found, quite unexpectedly, that I wanted you to trust me before you had reason to." He had protected her because he promised her father. But somewhere in the process, the promise had become something else entirely. The public hearing was held on a Tuesday. London turned out for it the way London turns out for anything that combines scandal, aristocracy, and the distant possibility of someone powerful being significantly humiliated. The chamber was full. The galleries were full. The corridor outside was full of people who had no legal right to be there but were present anyway, sustained by rumor and the irresistible pull of consequence. Lord Gerald Ashcombe arrived in his finest coat, flanked by his solicitors and his political allies and the particular confident bearing of a man who has survived scandal before and fully expects to survive this. He sat down. He arranged his papers. He looked across the chamber at Eleanor Whitmore, Eleanor Blackthorne now, technically, though that had not yet fully settled in either of their minds, and offered her a slight, acknowledging nod. The nod of a man who considers himself the senior party in a negotiation. Sebastian entered last. He did not hurry. He did not make a production of his entrance. He simply walked to his seat with the unhurried gravity of a man who has arranged every variable in the room before entering it, and sat. The chamber, all of it, went quiet. Not the polite quiet of an official proceeding. The instinctive quiet of people who have just registered that something serious is about to occur. What followed was methodical, thorough, and devastating. Haverstock, given the choice between loyalty to Ashcombe and a substantially reduced legal consequence, chose with admirable speed. He confessed. He documented. He named dates and amounts, and the specific evening when he had witnessed Ashcombe dictate the terms of Edmund Whitmore's manufactured financial ruin. Eleanor's father's letters were entered into evidence. They were detailed, careful, and damning. The correspondence of a man who had known what was happening to him and had chosen to document rather than despair. The proof of Cecilia's murder was presented last. It was met with a silence so complete that the sound of a dropped pen at the back of the gallery was audible across the entire chamber. Ashcombe's solicitors objected. Repeatedly. With increasing desperation. Each objection was met by the presiding judge with the patient patience of a man who had been thoroughly briefed before the session began. Briefed, it was understood, by someone with the access and the influence to ensure that thoroughness. When Sebastian finally rose to speak, he did so briefly. He did not declaim. He did not perform. He presented 3 additional documents, named 2 witnesses who had been waiting in an anteroom, and stated in the same quiet, level voice he used for everything else that Lord Ashcombe had conspired to defraud an estate, corrupt a legal instrument, cause the death of a woman under his protection, and obstruct justice for 2 years. The chamber was very still. "That concludes my remarks," Sebastian said, and sat. Ashcombe's confident bearing had, somewhere in the preceding hour, quietly departed the room. Justice had been served. But what came after justice was the question neither of them had fully prepared for. They returned to Thornfield in the late afternoon. The hearing had run long. The legal consequences for Ashcombe were proceeding through the appropriate mechanisms. Haverstock had arranged his own accommodation in a guest room at his solicitor's offices, which was the polite English way of describing a man who was cooperating with authorities. Eleanor's inheritance, the real one, the full one, had been frozen pending formal verification of her origins, a process that her new solicitor, she had acquired one, finally, of her own, described as a formality that would resolve itself within a fortnight. She was, objectively speaking, in a better position than she had occupied at any point in the preceding week. She was also, she realized as the carriage rolled through Thornfield's gates, not entirely sure what to do with any of it. Sebastian handed her out of the carriage with the same quiet care he had, she noticed now, offered her consistently from the beginning. Not performance. Not ceremony. Simply the unconscious attentiveness of someone who had gotten into the habit of noticing what she needed before she voiced it. They walked to the library, because that was where they walked when something needed to be said, and neither of them had yet found the exact words. Eleanor sat in her chair. Sebastian stood at his window. The larks had finished their evening business, and the garden had settled into its late-light stillness. "I could arrange the dissolution quietly," he said. "A private matter of record. Your inheritance will not be affected. Your name." Sebastian. He stopped. It was the first time she had used his given name. They both noticed. "I don't want the dissolution," she said. A pause. Very careful. "Eleanor. I know it wasn't the arrangement. I know you are. I know this was meant to be temporary. And I know you have been extraordinarily kind, and I understand if—" "Eleanor." She looked up. He had crossed the room. He was standing 3 feet away, and for the first time since she had collided with him in a rainy alley 4 days and an entire lifetime ago, his face had no composed surface on it at all. It was simply his face. "I do not want the dissolution either," he said. The larks, outside, resumed. She had fled into the storm looking for a stranger to save her. She had not known she was running toward the one person who had already been saving her, quietly, for years. 1 year later. The Somerset estate was restored in the spring. Eleanor had supervised the restoration herself, arriving each week with architectural drawings and the particular focused energy of someone reclaiming something precious. Sebastian came when Parliament was not in session, which was more frequently than parliamentary protocol strictly required, and spent most of his time there reading in the garden or arguing pleasantly with the head groundskeeper about the placement of a rose arbor. The inheritance had been verified, as promised, within a fortnight. Eleanor had allocated a portion to the development of a charitable trust for daughters of impoverished gentlemen, a cause that had, within 6 months, attracted more contributors than anyone had anticipated, including a notable anonymous donation from Thornfield House. Cecilia's family had received the full account of what had happened to her. The grief was old and would take time, but the truth, given at last, had something clarifying about it, something that permitted mourning to proceed where it had previously been trapped in the amber of suspicion. On a Thursday evening in late April, Eleanor found Sebastian in the portrait gallery. The covering had been removed from Cecilia's portrait. It hung with the others now, honored and present, a woman who had been brave enough to pursue justice and was owed the dignity of not being hidden. Sebastian stood looking at it for a long moment after Eleanor joined him. "She would have liked you," he said. She had the same habit of solving problems that other people hadn't yet noticed were problems. That sounds like a compliment with very long edges. It was intended as one. Eleanor slipped her hand into his. He held it the way he held most things, with the quiet certainty of someone who has made a decision and does not revisit it. "The man I begged to marry before dawn," she said softly. "I never thanked you properly. You organized 6 months of correspondence chaos," he said. "We are well past even." She laughed, a sound that had become, over the preceding year, one of his preferred sounds in the world. He had not told her this. He suspected she had gathered it anyway. "There is something I should warn you about," he said after a moment. She turned. His expression was not alarmed, but it was serious in the way of things that required careful handling. "A name has surfaced," he said quietly. "Someone from before Ashcombe. Someone who may have been the original architect of what was done to Cecilia's family, and yours. Someone who has, by all indication, been watching this entire affair very attentively." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Then we find them. It may not be simple. Nothing worth doing has been." He studied her, this woman who had run through a storm toward him and changed the composition of everything he had believed his life to be. And he thought that Edmund Whitmore, wherever he was, had known exactly what he was doing. The enemy from Sebastian's past had been watching for a very long time, and had already placed someone inside Thornfield House.